I signed my own divorce papers, I just didn't know I'd already lost. The pen was still warm in my hand when I heard tires crunching against gravel outside, slow and deliberate, like whoever was driving didn't want to be noticed until it was too late to look away. I set the pen down. I walked to the window, and that's when I saw them, 3 black SUVs, gliding into a driveway that legally wasn't mine anymore. Not since 11 that morning. Not since I'd watched my own signature dry on a page that ended 16 years of my life. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Because in that town, everyone knew exactly whose cars those were, and none of us had ever seen them stop for someone like me. The doors didn't open right away. That was the part that unsettled me most. The waiting, the stillness. 3 vehicles parked in perfect formation like they'd rehearsed it. Engines humming low, tinted windows giving nothing away. My neighbors had already started peeking through their blinds. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. The same way I could feel something shifting underneath my life that I hadn't given permission for. I kept asking myself one question, over and over, quietly, like if I said it enough times an answer would appear out of nowhere. Why would the richest family in this entire county send 3 cars, for me, on the exact day my marriage legally ended, in the exact hour I thought I was finally alone? I want to tell you now, before anything else, that by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why my husband never said a word. Not one word of warning, not one word of explanation, not even a word of goodbye. You will understand why a man who once promised me forever chose silence instead, and why that silence was about to collide with a family whose name alone could change the direction of a person's entire life. What I didn't know standing at that window was that the quiet of my marriage and the arrival of those cars were not 2 separate stories. They were the same story, and I was only just now walking into the middle of it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Renata, and 3 months before those cars ever touched my driveway, I was still calling myself a wife. I was still setting 2 plates at dinner, even on the nights my husband Marcus didn't come home until the house had gone dark and cold around me. Marcus wasn't a loud man. He never had been. But there's a difference between a quiet man and a man who has gone somewhere inside himself that you can no longer follow. And somewhere in those last few months, my husband became the second kind. He stopped finishing sentences. He stopped meeting my eyes at the table. And when I asked him what was wrong, he would only say the same 4 words. I'm handling it, Renata. As if handling it meant leaving me standing outside a door he had quietly locked from within. I didn't know the name Avery yet. Not really. Not in any way that meant something. I'd heard it the way you hear the name of any powerful family in a small town. Attached to hospital wings, scholarship funds, a foundation that seemed to touch every corner of the county without anyone quite explaining how. I never imagined that name would end up parked outside my house in the shape of 3 black SUVs, sent for me specifically, on the very day my marriage ended in silence. I never imagined that the man I married, the man who couldn't find the words to explain why he was leaving, had spent his final months tangled up with people whose reach went far beyond anything I understood. So here is where I'll leave you for now, standing at that window with me, watching 3 doors that still hadn't opened, wondering the same thing you're probably wondering right now. What did Marcus know that he never told me? Who are the Averys, and what could they possibly want from a woman whose husband had just walked out without so much as a note? And why, of all the silence Marcus gave me in those final months, did it end with something loud enough to bring the richest family in the county straight to my front door? Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything I thought I understood about the man I married. To understand what happened at that window, you have to go back to the beginning, back to the version of Marcus I fell in love with, because the man who left me in silence was not the man who first walked into my life. I met Marcus at a community fundraiser in the fall. The kind of event where folding chairs outnumber the guests and the coffee is always burnt. And he was the one refilling the coffee anyway, laughing at his own joke that nobody else had heard yet. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't the kind of man who filled a room the moment he entered it. He was the kind of man who noticed things, who remembered that I took my coffee black, who asked my name twice, because he wanted to make sure he said it right the second time. We married 2 years later in my mother's backyard. Under string lights, Marcus had spent an entire weekend hanging himself, refusing help from anyone, insisting it had to be his hands that did it. That was who he was in those years, a man who believed love was something you built with your own two hands, quietly, without needing anyone to watch him do it. We didn't have much money starting out, but we had rhythm. We had our Sunday mornings, our terrible attempts at cooking together, our habit of dancing in the kitchen to nothing in particular. I used to tell people that Marcus loved me the way he did everything else, without announcement, without needing credit, just steady and constant, like a heartbeat you stop noticing because it never once skips. There were smaller versions of him too, ones I only remember clearly now, looking back with different eyes. Marcus always kept one drawer in his desk locked, even in the early years, and when I asked about it once, laughing, assuming it was nothing, he only said, "Some things are mine to carry, Renata," and smiled in a way that closed the conversation before I could open it further. I let it go the way you let go of 100 small oddities in a marriage, filing it under the things that make a person who they are, rather than the things that should worry you. I had no reason yet to believe that drawer held anything heavier than old letters or forgotten receipts. It was in our 10th year together that I heard the name Avery for the first time in any context that touched our lives directly, and even then it barely registered. Marcus had come home late from what he called a job, vague as always about the details, and I noticed a business card on the kitchen counter the next morning, cream-colored, embossed, the name Avery printed across it in letters too elegant for the kind of work Marcus usually did. I asked him about it in passing, half distracted, still making breakfast, and he took the card from my hand almost too quickly, saying only that it was nothing, an old contact, someone he used to know. I believed him completely. I had absolutely no reason not to. Looking back now, I can see the small cracks forming long before the silence ever swallowed him whole, moments I explained away because explaining them away was easier than facing what they might have meant. Marcus started staying later, at whatever work he wouldn't fully describe. He started keeping his phone face down on every surface, a habit so gradual I couldn't tell you the exact week it began. He still kissed me goodnight. He still reached for my hand during long car rides out of pure instinct rather than performance. But there was a distance opening up somewhere behind his eyes, a distance I mistook for exhaustion, for stress, for the ordinary wear of a marriage entering its later years, rather than the beginning of something I could not yet name. What I didn't understand then, what I wouldn't understand for a long time after those 3 black SUVs pulled into my driveway, was that Marcus wasn't pulling away from our marriage at all. He was trying, in his own quiet and stubborn way, to protect me from something he hadn't found the courage to explain, something connected to that locked drawer, that cream-colored card, and a family name that would soon mean far more to my life than I could have possibly imagined on that ordinary morning at the kitchen counter. The man I loved was already carrying a weight I knew nothing about, and he had decided, without asking me, that carrying it alone was a kindness rather than a betrayal. The final months crept in so slowly that I didn't recognize them as the end, until I was already standing in the middle of it. Marcus stopped finishing his sentences somewhere around March, trailing off mid-thought as if the second half of what he wanted to say had become too heavy to lift. I would ask him a simple question, something as small as how his day went, and he would answer with only a few words before his eyes drifted toward the window, toward nothing, toward some conversation happening entirely inside his own head that I was no longer invited to hear. I told myself it was work. I told myself it was stress. I told myself anything that let me keep believing the man across the table from me was still fully present. By April, the silences had grown longer than the conversations. Dinners passed with only the sound of forks against plates, and when I reached for his hand, the way I always had, he would let me hold it, but his fingers no longer curled back around mine the way they used to. I started noticing how often he checked his phone and then immediately set it face down, how often he stepped outside to take calls he never explained afterward, how often he came home smelling faintly of a place I couldn't identify. Not perfume, not anything I could point to directly, just something unfamiliar, clinging to a man I thought I knew completely. I asked him once, directly, if he was seeing someone else. He looked at me like I had struck him, and said only, "Renata, If you knew what I was protecting you from, you would never ask me that again." I didn't understand what those words meant then, and honestly, I let myself resent him for saying them instead of asking what he meant by them, because resentment felt easier than fear. There were nights I lay awake beside him, listening to him breathe, wondering whether the man sleeping next to me was slipping away because of something he'd done, or because of something being done to him that he refused to let me see. I noticed he'd started sleeping with one hand near his phone at all times, like a man waiting for a call he dreaded and needed in equal measure. I noticed the drawer in his desk had a new lock on it, heavier than the last one, as though whatever he kept inside had grown too important to risk even the smallest chance of me finding it by accident. By May, Marcus had stopped arguing with me altogether, and if you have ever loved someone, you know that the absence of arguing is not peace. It is often the loudest warning sign there is. A man who still cares will fight to be understood. A man who has already made a decision he believes he cannot undo will simply go quiet and let you exhaust yourself trying to reach him. I didn't know yet that Marcus had already made a decision. One he believed with his whole heart was the only way left to protect me, and that every ounce of distance I felt growing between us wasn't him leaving my heart, it was him trying, in the only way he knew how, to leave my life before something else could take him from it, in a far more permanent way. The morning it ended, there was no warning at all. I woke up to an empty side of the bed, still faintly warm, as though he had only just risen. I found the papers on the kitchen table before I found him, already signed on his side, already notarized, already final in every legal sense a marriage can be final. There was no note beside them. There was no explanation taped to the refrigerator, the way there might be in the version of this story you're used to hearing. There was only Marcus's handwriting on a single line beneath his signature, 4 words that told me nothing and everything at once. "Forgive me, Renata, please." By the time I looked up from that table, he was already gone, and the house had never felt so completely empty. I signed my side of those papers with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, because staying married to silence felt like its own kind of drowning, and I told myself that whatever Marcus was protecting me from, I no longer had the right to ask about it. I dropped the signed papers at the courthouse before noon. I came home to a house that legally wasn't half mine anymore, sat down at that same kitchen table, and tried to convince myself the worst part was already over. That night, long after the sun had gone down, I heard an engine idling outside my window, low and steady, for exactly 11 minutes, though I didn't understand yet why I would remember that number for the rest of my life, or why that same sound would return to my driveway, multiplied by 3, in the shape of vehicles I had never once expected to see parked outside my home. In the weeks after Marcus disappeared from my daily life, I became something I never expected to become. A woman quietly investigating her own marriage, searching for answers in places I never thought I would need to look. It started small, almost by accident. I was going through old files to sort out what remained legally mine, and I found a bank statement tucked behind a folder of tax documents. A second account I had never known existed, with deposits and withdrawals that didn't match anything in our normal life together. The amounts weren't enormous, but they were consistent, appearing on the same date every single month, like payment for something Marcus had never once mentioned to me in 16 years of marriage. Not long after that, I found a phone bill for a number I didn't recognize, billed to an address I had never heard of, a storage facility on the far side of town that I didn't know Marcus had ever set foot in. I sat with that bill for 3 full days before I gathered the courage to drive out there myself, half expecting to find nothing, half terrified I would find exactly what I was afraid of. When I finally stood in front of Unit 211, I half convinced myself there would be evidence of another woman inside, a life Marcus had built quietly beside the one he built with me. Instead, I found boxes of paperwork, folders labeled with dates, going back nearly a decade, and one folder, thicker than the rest, simply labeled with the name Avery. The rumors around town moved faster than I could keep up with, the way they always do in a place where everyone believes they know everyone else's business better than their own. Someone said Marcus had lost his job over a year earlier and had been too proud to tell me, quietly working odd jobs to hide the shame of it. Someone else swore they'd seen him with a woman outside a restaurant 2 towns over, And for one sleepless week, I let myself believe that story completely, until I discovered the woman in question was his estranged sister, someone he hadn't spoken of in years after a falling out neither of them ever fully explained to me. Every lead I chased led somewhere different, and none of them led anywhere close to the truth. My mother, who had never fully trusted the quiet in Marcus even in our happiest years, told me plainly that she always suspected he was carrying something he never intended to share with either of us. My closest friends split down the middle, some certain he had simply run from a marriage that had grown too comfortable to fight for, others insisting a man who once hung string lights by hand for an entire weekend does not simply stop loving someone without a reason large enough to justify the silence. I stopped listening to most of it after a while, because none of them had seen the folder in that storage unit, the one with the Avery name printed across the tab in Marcus's own steady handwriting, filled with documents I didn't yet have the courage to read all the way through. It was on a quiet Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, that the convoy returned to my driveway, for the first time since the morning I'd watched it from my window in disbelief. This time, one door opened. A woman stepped out, dressed simply despite the wealth surrounding her, and walked toward my porch, without hesitation, as though she had done this exact walk in her mind 100 times before actually doing it. She didn't introduce herself right away. She only handed me a single sealed envelope, cream-colored, embossed with the same crest I recognized instantly from that old business card years earlier, and said only one sentence before turning back toward the car. "Marcus asked us to make sure this reached you when the time was right." I stood on that porch for a long time after the SUVs pulled away, envelope in hand, unopened, my heart pounding in a way it hadn't pounded since the morning I found those signed papers on the kitchen table. Everything in me wanted to tear it open immediately, and everything in me was terrified of what I might find inside, because some part of me already understood that whatever truth Marcus had been protecting me from for all those months was finally about to reach me, not through his own voice, but through the careful, deliberate hands of a family whose name I was only now beginning to understand had been quietly woven through the final chapter of my marriage all along. I waited until the house was completely silent before I finally opened that envelope, sitting at the same kitchen table where I had found the divorce papers weeks earlier, as though the table itself had become the place where every hard truth in my life was destined to arrive. Inside, there were several folded pages, and beneath them, a smaller envelope with my name written across it, in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. Marcus's handwriting, the same steady hand that once labeled boxes in a storage unit I hadn't known existed. My fingers trembled as I set the legal papers aside for a moment and opened the smaller envelope first, because whatever truth those documents held, I needed to hear it in his voice before anyone else's. His letter began simply, "Renata, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer able to explain any of it to you myself, and I need you to understand that everything I did in those final months, I did because I loved you more than I ever knew how to say out loud." He explained that nearly a year before the divorce, a routine visit to a doctor had uncovered something serious, something that gave him a timeline he refused to share with me directly, because he could not bear the thought of watching me grieve him slowly, day by day, for months on end. He wrote that he made a decision alone, one he now asked my forgiveness for, to protect me from that grief, by protecting me from him instead. The legal documents beneath his letter told the rest of the story in language far less tender than his own. Marcus had spent those final months working quietly with the Avery family's private foundation, an arrangement his letter explained had actually begun years earlier, long before his diagnosis, doing financial and structural work for them that he had never once mentioned to me out of habit and privacy rather than deception. When his diagnosis became certain, he used that same relationship to restructure everything he owned, every account, every asset, every remaining piece of the life we had built together, and quietly transferred all of it into my name through the foundation's legal team, ensuring I would want for nothing, no matter what happened to him or when. He explained the divorce itself in a single paragraph that I read 4 times before I could fully absorb it. He said that if we had remained married when he passed, a portion of what he wanted to protect for me would have been delayed for months in legal proceedings, tied up in matters far more complicated than either of us had the patience to survive. By ending the marriage on paper while never once ending it in his heart, he ensured every asset reached me immediately and directly, free of complications, free of waiting, free of anyone questioning my right to what he wanted me to have. His final act of love, as he called it, was choosing paperwork over presents, silence over explanation, distance over the unbearable weight of watching me suffer alongside him. 2 days later, I sat across from an attorney representing the Avery family's foundation, a calm and careful woman who confirmed every word of that letter in language far more official than Marcus had ever used with me. She explained that Marcus had, in fact, once saved the life of the Avery family's patriarch decades earlier, in circumstances she described only briefly out of respect for both families involved, and that the foundation had quietly supported him ever since as a debt they considered impossible to fully repay. When his diagnosis became known to them, they didn't hesitate to help him structure everything in my favor, treating his final wishes with the same seriousness they would treat their own family's affairs. Sitting in that office, surrounded by documents confirming a truth I never could have imagined standing at my kitchen window weeks earlier, I finally understood why 3 black SUVs had once pulled into my driveway on the exact day my divorce became final. It wasn't wealth announcing itself. It wasn't a family flaunting what they had. It was quiet gratitude, finishing a promise a dying man had made to protect the woman he loved, delivered the only way his silence would allow. Marcus never stopped loving me for a single day of those final months. He simply loved me in a language I hadn't yet learned how to read, one built entirely out of protection instead of words. I thought the attorney's office held every truth left for me to receive, but she wasn't quite finished, and what she said next changed the entire shape of the grief I had already started carrying. She paused before closing her folder, looked at me carefully, and said there was one more thing Marcus had asked her to share with me, but only if I asked directly whether he was still alive. My whole body went still. I asked her the question before I could stop myself, my voice barely above a whisper, and she nodded slowly, telling me that Marcus was, in fact, still alive, receiving care in a private facility the Avery Foundation quietly maintained for situations exactly like his, and that he had asked, again and again, that I not be told unless I asked with my own voice. I didn't wait for another explanation. I asked for the address before she had even finished speaking, and within the hour, I was standing outside a quiet building on the edge of the county, the same kind of quiet Marcus himself had always carried, unremarkable from the outside, holding something enormous within. A nurse led me down a hallway that felt far longer than it should have, and when she opened the door to his room, I saw him for the first time in weeks, thinner than I remembered, but unmistakably him, unmistakably the same man who once hung string lights by hand rather than ask for help. He looked up at me, and for the first time since that morning at the kitchen table, he finally spoke the words he had spent months too afraid to say out loud. He told me everything the letter couldn't fully hold, how terrified he had been, not of dying, but of watching me watch him die, slowly, piece by piece, until the man I loved disappeared before I ever had the chance to properly say goodbye. He told me the silence wasn't distance, it was fear dressed up as strength, a decision made by a man who believed protecting my heart mattered more than protecting our marriage. I sat beside his bed for hours that first evening, holding a hand I had once held across a wedding altar, understanding finally that every quiet month, every locked drawer, every unfinished sentence had been Marcus fighting a battle he never wanted me to witness, armored entirely in silence because he didn't know any other way to be brave for both of us. In the weeks that followed, I visited him every single day, and slowly, the distance that had grown between us during those final painful months began to close, not because the diagnosis changed, but because the silence finally did. We talked more in those weeks than we had in the entire final year of our marriage combined, filling in every gap his fear had once carved between us. He apologized more times than I could count, and each time, I told him the same thing, that I would have chosen every single day of watching him fight over a single day of not knowing where he was or why he had gone. Love, I realized, was never meant to be protected from difficulty. It was meant to be carried through it, together, out loud. If there is one thing this entire story taught me, it's that silence is rarely what it appears to be on the surface. Sometimes silence is abandonment, and sometimes silence is a man trying, clumsily and imperfectly, to carry an unbearable weight alone so the person he loves never has to feel its full impact. I think about those 3 black SUVs often, how frightening they looked pulling into my driveway that first morning, how certain I was that they represented an ending rather than the beginning of the truth I needed most. Would you have recognized the difference between a man leaving you and a man quietly trying to protect you, the only way fear had ever taught him how? I know now that I almost didn't, and I think about how close I came to never finding out the difference at all. I've told you my story exactly as I lived it. From the morning those 3 black SUVs pulled into a driveway that wasn't mine anymore, all the way to the quiet hospital room where I finally understood what Marcus's silence had actually meant. But I want to ask you something before you go, because I think every one of you watching has your own version of this question buried somewhere in your own life. Have you ever mistaken someone's silence for rejection, when in reality they were carrying something so heavy they didn't know how to hand it to you without breaking you along with them? I'd love to know in the comments, because I think you'd be surprised how many of us have lived some version of this exact same misunderstanding. If this story moved you the way it moved me, to actually live it, wait until you hear what happens in our next story, because what one woman discovers, hidden inside her late grandmother's final letter, is going to leave you speechless from the very first minute. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss it, because these are the kinds of stories that remind us love doesn't always look the way we expect it to, and sometimes the people who seem to be walking away from us are actually the ones fighting hardest to stay. Thank you for staying with me through every part of Renata and Marcus's story, and I'll see you very soon in the next one.